The Land Cruiser is back after a 3-year break, but not exactly. This is the new 2024 Toyota Land Cruiser. Not the full-size Land Cruiser, but this is a 250 series Land Cruiser. And in today's video, we're going to do a proper technical review under the hood. We're going to take a look underneath it, inside and outside it. We're going to talk about some things we like, some things we do not like, right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood. And the 24 Land Cruiser has one powertrain option only. That is, just keeping it simple, I suppose. So they are calling it iForce Max. Let's dive into that. So basically, the engine in this system is going to be the T24A FTS, 4-cylinder, 2.4-liter turbocharged, direct end-port injected engine. Made it to this is a bespoke transmission for this hybrid system. It's called the L580F. We're going to get to the transmission in a little bit, but in the hybrid system, which by the way is a parallel hybrid system, we'll get into it in a little bit. Let's start with this engine, talk about its mechanical construction. At the very top, this engine has a plastic valve cover. Decent quality, and this is how the automotive industry is switching all to plastic valve covers to save weight and whatnot. Usually cost, not weight, but weight, that's yeah. Something about this engine that I really dislike, and this is very un-Toyota-like. They put the direct injectors right on top of the valve cover. This is very BMW-like and un-Toyota-like. I don't know why they did this with this engine. It makes service for the valve cover so complicated and unnecessarily so, but that's what they deem necessary. That's the only really downside that I have about this engine. Now the cylinder head is a two-piece cylinder head. You have the cam cradle or carrier, and then you have the cylinder head itself. This is a roller rocker hydraulic lifter engine. It does have dual variable valve timing. Both of them are oil controlled, so you have these little solenoids in the front that just push the bolt that holds the gear, which actually opens the passage of oil and lets oil in to control the variable valve timing. Very simple variable valve timing, no electronic, no nothing. It's very basic actually in 2024. Now the block is all aluminum block. It does have an offset crank, and it does have cast iron liners that are spinny or spiny. They are basically put on, and then the block is cast around it for very good mechanical adhesion, but they are not serviceable because they are very thin. If they get damaged, that's the end of that. You need a new block, and that's nothing new. Basically, all Toyota aluminum blocks are like that. Now, something about this block that is interesting. It doesn't have main crank caps that are individual. It is a kind of a griddle or a platform that carries all of them and goes on. Now the debate will go on and on and on about why is the 2022 to 24 engines having issues with the Tundra and all that. Because of that, that's actually false. This is a better design overall. Every engine person will agree that is a better design. You have more stiffness spread across this entire panel instead of this tiny little cap. That is the bottom line, and they did that because these engines are pushing a lot of power and they do need the extra stiffening. Now this still, even with that, it still have two-piece oil pan. So there's the lower pan, which is steel, and there's the upper one, which is aluminum. That's a pretty standard with Toyota engines. Now this engine is turbocharged. It does have a single twin scroll turbocharger. Pretty decent location because of the configuration of this car. This turbo is oil and coolant cooled. It does have a vacuum operated wastegate, which is very basic, and that's how you want it. Very basic. And then it does have an air-to-air intercooler. Not the most efficient, but it's actually basic. It does have a lot more piping, but it's basic. It's just two pipes, one going, one coming back, and that's about it. Keeping things very simple. This engine also has a two-piece front timing cover. So Toyota, for the longest time, they had issues with oil leaks from the front timing cover. Where the cylinder head meets the block, meets the front cover, that area was a weak area. So in order to avoid that, I feel like they kind of went the long road, maybe created more issues with that, but the intent was we're gonna put two covers, so that area where the block meets the head doesn't have sealer. It kind of bypasses that, so you have cover, chain, all the stuff, and then another cover that sits on top. They started that with the A25A, which is an engine that's been out since since 2018, and now we see it in basically almost all their new engines. It works, but that's a little bit of complication, and that's the only downside to it. Now, this engine has a single timing chain, goes from the cams to the crank. That's the only chain on this engine. It does have an internal tensioner, which is not nice, something I've been using for a long time. Now, this engine does have a balance shaft. Being a 4-cylinder, it does have a balance shaft. That balance shaft sits right underneath the crank, and it directly is driven by the crankshaft. Underneath it, though, is the oil pump. So the oil pump is not driven by a chain, it's actually driven by the balance shaft. So they're kind of like gear to gear driven together. That is actually a pretty cool design. Now, this engine does have D4S, that's Toyota, what Toyota calls it. Basically, you have 4 direct injectors, 4 port injectors, so you can have both systems. Carbon buildup is not an issue with these because you do have the port injectors. But the only concern I have is, I mean, the high pressure fuel pump sits on the valve cover. That's not a big deal. 2 bolts and comes out. It's very simple. That's how they've always been doing it. But the injectors being on top is a concern. As these things get older, and as you have a leak, you need to get in there for something. It's a giant process to remove these direct injectors. You got to replace the seals, and it adds a lot of cost. See, the A25A, which is kind of a sister engine to this one, had them on the side underneath the intake manifold. Great place, out of view. This one has them right on top. That's the only downside about this engine. Now let's talk about the cooling system of this engine, because this car actually has 2 cooling systems. One of them for a hybrid system, we'll talk about it a little bit. Other one's from the engine. It's a pretty basic system for 2024. It does have a coolant distribution valve that sends coolant wherever it needs to go for rapid warm-up. Pretty basic. That sounds like complicated, it's actually not. But the biggest surprise is it has a mechanical water pump. And that's actually the only accessory on the belt. That's it. The compressor is electric, and there's no power steering. And there's no alternator being a hybrid. Talk about that in a little bit, but that's the only accessory. But what I love about them is they did not put a stretch belt. They have done this in some of their models. Horrible idea. Like Highlander Hybrid has the old Highlander Hybrid with a V6 has a stretch belt. Horrible idea. This has a proper tensioner, which I love. It's a very basic tensioner because there's only one component, tiny belt, but still, they put a tensioner. And the biggest thing is, it's not a plastic pulley tensioner. It's actually a metal or steel pulley tensioner. I love that. These are the little stuff that make a difference, folks, over time. Now, this engine has a vacuum pump in a very unhappy place, all the way in the back where you can't even reach it. The reason for that is not because of the brakes. The brakes don't even have a vacuum booster. We'll talk about the brakes a little bit. Because you have the wastegate control being vacuum, and direct injected engines do not make decent vacuum. So they put a vacuum pump just to boost that, so we always have a decent supply of vacuum to operate that wastegate. And interestingly here, we are kind of moving away from mechanical fans. This does not have a mechanical fan, which I actually love it. I think electric fans have gotten so good lately that we can just get an electric fan and that's sufficient, because this has an electric fan. Makes the engine very quiet, less load on the engine, and life is great. Now, this engine does have a starter, even though it's a hybrid. And that starter is there for certain conditions to start the engine and as a spare in case there is a problem. That is really cool. And speaking of the hybrid system, let's dive into that. Let's start with the hybrid system, starting with the transmission. Let's get the transmission out of the way because that's where it starts. The transmission in this car is the L580F. So the transmission itself is a standard direct shift 8-speed transmission, torque converter, very normal transmission. But between the engine and the transmission is when the hybrid system magic starts. This is called 1MHV hybrid system. So it is basically one motor hybrid vehicle system. It's very similar to the Tacoma Limited with the hybrid system, all-time four-wheel drive, and it's very similar to the Tundra hybrid as well. So here's how this works. Between the engine and the transmission, there is a module. That module contains a very large electric motor, and it contains a clutch. That clutch is called K0. That clutch can disengage the engine or engage it. So here's how this is going to work. You're driving in EV mode, even though these are not exactly your typical parallel series hybrids from Toyota. This is only a parallel hybrid, but still you do have a short periods of EV mode. So what's going to happen there is engine will shut off, clutch will engage the motor, and then the motor will drive the transmission. Then when demand is high, the engine will come on, and then you have two things. You're either going to have the engine and the motor drive the car, or the engine will drive the car and the motor will generate power to charge the battery. And then when you step on the brakes, the motive force of the road will actually turn that motor to generate kind of like regenerative braking. It's a very basic theory how it works, and it works pretty decent for the intended purpose here. Now let's talk about some of the components of this system. We talked about the motor, which, by the way, that clutch is hydraulically applied. So to increase its efficiency and make sure it works properly, this transmission does have an electric oil pump in addition to the mechanical one. So when the engine is off, you can actually still drive that clutch and engage it. And it has a separate valve body, so it would not interfere with the transmission operation. It has a separate oil, separate valve body, separate hydraulic circuit. And that's how they did this, to make sure that everything works properly. Now, in addition to that, you do have an inverter that sits under the hood. Normally where you'd expect your 12-volt battery to be. 12-volt battery in this car is all the way in the back. That inverter does many things. One of them is it takes the place of an alternator. It has a DC to DC converter. It takes that high voltage from the battery, steps it down to 12 volts, powers electronic, and charges the 12-volt battery. Now, that inverter also sends power, takes power, does all the changes, and it also powers the electronic AC compressor because it is electric, not belt driven. And then you have a cooling system for the inverter mainly. That cooling system has a separate radiator, separate electric water pump that circulates coolant, very similar in design to that of regular parallel series Toyota hybrid. Now, the hybrid battery sits all the way in the back, not behind underneath the back seats. It's actually behind them, which is not a great spot. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But that is a 288 volt nickel metal hydride battery, not a lithium ion. This is, again, a decision that is interesting. You can look at it both ways. Well, old technology or proven technology. That's how you look at it. That battery is air-cooled. It does have two vents inside the car, and they do have filters which you should not block and should keep free. We'll also show you those and talk about them in a little bit. Now let's talk briefly about the brakes and the four-wheel drive system. The brakes here are typical hybrid car brakes. They are essentially a brake-by-wire in a way, not entirely though. So you do have on the brake pedal a sensor that measures what is the force of brake you're demanding and how fast are you applying it. And then based on that, it's going to determine, are we doing regenerative braking? Are we using hydraulic brakes? Or what's the mix and how much do we need based on your input? Now, when this system fails for whatever reason, it's going to default to manual front brakes. The brakes will be hard to press, but you will still have brakes, not completely brake-by-wire. That is how it's designed. It's very similar. You just have this giant unit right here. Very similar to regular hybrids in the way it operates, and things are very basic there. The four-wheel drive system, which is very important in the Land Cruiser here. This is an all-time four-wheel drive system, so it's always in four-wheel drive. And in order to do that, you do have a Torsen limited slip center differential that allows the front and rear wheels to spin again at different speeds and not lock the drivetrain. You do have low range. You can lock the center differential, and in this particular trim, 1958, you can lock the rear differential as well. So the modes that this has are 2 plus 3. You can say 3. So it has 4 high, which you are always in 4 high, open, or F. So H4F. Basically freewheeling, you're using that center limited slip differential. When you go into high 4L, you lock the center differential, but there is a separate button that you press, not the knob. And then when you go into 4 low, you automatically lock the center differential. That's how this works. Pretty basic how it operates, and I love that it is like that because you're always in four-wheel drive. You don't have to go in two-wheel drive mode and then you're can't make sharp turns. No, it has that Torsen limited slip differential, which is really cool. Now let's talk about the quality of everything. This is a Land Cruiser. We're going to hold them to a very high standard. The only thing I see here is we recently reviewed a Tacoma. It was not a hybrid, but it was very similar build quality to this. So is the Land Cruiser losing its build quality, or is the Tacoma or other models really stepping up their game? I hope it is the later. The only concern I have here, I mean, the engine bay is really wide open. There's a lot of space. There's not even gimmicky covers and whatever. Everything is wide open. There's some plastic use. Now, Toyota, from my experience, the plastic they use is usually high quality, but it's still plastic. In the cooling system, that's not a good idea. I feel like there are places where they used it just elaborately a little bit. I wish they wouldn't do that, because plastic and coolant don't get along. The other thing is the turbo reliability. You hear all the problems with the 2022 to 24 Tundras and all this jazz. Well, this engine has been out for a few years, actually, not exclusively to this. It's been out in the 23 Highlander kind of quietly. That's a high volume model. So far, so good. There's been a few issues with check engine light and whatnot, with some software updates, but there hasn't been anything catastrophic yet. I hope that remains the case. If you are concerned about the turbo, there's one thing I will tell you. Maintenance is key with these engines. See, some Toyota owners, unfortunately, they took that whole Toyota reliability thing the wrong way. We're not going to maintain this car, we're going to neglect it, and it's just going to last. Well, that's a thing of the past. These engines, they are reliable if you take care of them, and you really got to take care of them. They will love their maintenance, especially a turbo engine. Oil changes, folks. I cannot emphasize how important that is with these engines. They're very high tolerance engines, and they are turbocharged. There's a lot of heat here. You got to take care of the maintenance, and we're hoping that these things will last like the past, and we see a lot of miles out of them. And for the old timers out there that will not touch anything with a turbo engine, this is all I got to say. Would you please give some extra respect to the great grandson of the 22 RE? Because there was a time where there was 4 cylinders in these off-road trucks. Nobody complained. Well, now we have them again. Yes, we have a turbo, but for all time's sake, for the great grandson of the 22 RE, let's give it a chance. Let's take a look underneath the 2024 Toyota Land Cruiser. And there is a very beautiful sight to behold. This is an all-new cover that they specifically designed for this car. I really like it. Not because it says Toyota here, not because it's a little bit lighter weight than usual, and not because they completely did not leave an opening for the filter. They did one thing that we really appreciate. If you had a previous TRD Pro or the TRD Shield on these trucks, they were a pain to remove. They were really just ridiculously engineered. This, however, they did one thing. It's just a small thing that makes a huge difference. You see this little cutout here? And then a little cutout here? This makes all the difference, folks. Because here's how you're gonna remove this. You're gonna remove all the bolts except these two. Loosen these two, slide this cover sideways and lower it. And then when you're putting it on, I mean, it is a lighter cover, but it's not as light. It's still a little heavy. You're gonna put it up, slide it, and it's gonna hook on these 2 bolts. Then you start all your bolts and you're ready to go. Same thing in the back. The second cover, same thing. Got on both sides. We really appreciate that. This is a big thing. And this cover, very heavy duty, and it extends all the way to the back. Usually, even the TRD models, they'll usually go till here, and this is just open. Land Cruiser, I love that. Now, let's look at a few things here. They did put this flap that kind of covers the side of the engine. I mean, you can kind of see oil filters right there, very easily accessible. You do have to remove this though, otherwise it'll make a mess. But these are a little bit on the flimsy side, and they do leave this giant gap. I feel like if we put them behind this eccentric, kind of like so, it would just close it up a little bit and hold it from flopping around. But I guess the intended design was this way. So there is that. Since we are here, let's look at the front suspension. Very familiar front suspension with modifications. You do have a aluminum knuckle over here. That is something they're starting to do, with a ball joint that is on the control arm. Speaking of the control arm, just look at this big thing, and Toyota always did that with their control arms. It's a very sturdy control arm. The upper one is also steel. It is not aluminum. It's only the knuckle that is aluminum. Big beefy axles, which is nice. Rack and pinion The end of it is aluminum. This is something they are changing. I wish it was still steel, but these are aluminum. Now, if we wrap around and look on this side, 4-piston caliper that looks exactly like all Toyota trucks. Very familiar design, very simple. They will seize up in the future. Nothing changes there. Business as usual. Sway bar is right here. So this particular trim, the 1958, does have a regular sway bar in the front. If you go to the higher trims, optional is the front disconnecting sway bar. I wish this model had it because this is the only thing it's missing it for being the ultimate off-roader, but doesn't even have it as an option, the 1958 trim. Basically what that does, there's an actuator that sits in between the bars and it can disconnect the two bars, but then when you get to a certain speed, it automatically engages it because it assumes you're driving on open road at that point. You don't need it to disconnect anymore for stability. Then we look at the transmission. Let's wrap around. So we talked about this and how it works. Do you see this unit right here? This is actually where the K0 clutch and the motor is, and it has, you notice, a separate oil pan, separate drain plug and fill plug. It is completely separate from the transmission. It has its own fluid as well. This is the transmission. I really like this transmission, not only from a driving perspective, that anybody can tell you, but look at the construction here. Steel oil pan, and then this style gasket doesn't have a little flimsy gasket. This style gasket actually seals very good. And another thing, when these cars get old and rust gets a hold of them, just like the Tundra is notorious for that, previous second generation Tundra. You see how these bolts are through bolts? I really appreciate that they did that. The last one is a little bit more difficult, but they are basically, almost all of them are through bolts, except the very, very back ones. These two. They are actually through bolts, but you have to pull the transfer case off or the extension housing. I really like these little details, folks, because they make a huge difference. And the other thing is, look here. We have a cooler. It's not what everybody wants for towing, but we still have a proper cooler here. The other thing is, very familiar. If we come up here, see that? That is a super familiar neutral safety switch mounted exactly in the same spot. I like to see this. They're not reinventing the wheel because this stuff is very old school design and it works great. Now we look at this side though, where that comes out, you will see a sight of kind of a breath of fresh air. Is that a cable on a modern transmission? Yes, it is, because this has a proper shifter inside. We'll look at it when we get there. Love this stuff. There is a mix of new stuff, old stuff, which we love it. Speaking of old stuff that we love, thank you, Toyota, for doing this. Let's look at the drive shaft here. Oh, what do we look at that? If you look at it from the other side, I think you'll see it better. Grease fitting is back. This has a grease fitting, but usually the third generation Tacoma also only had one in the back. But we look here, this one also has one. It's very difficult to see it on camera. If you come here and show them, that one has it as well. Thank you very much for doing this. And then the front drive shaft, not only do the U-joints have grease fittings, the yoke as well has a grease fitting. We really appreciate this stuff. This is what people want. We don't want them sealed U-joints that just come apart. We can grease those. We're happy. Let's look at the frame here. There are a few interesting things. This is a fully boxed frame. It is an all-new design because it doesn't look like anything of the previous 4Runner. This is closer to the Tacoma frame, new Tacoma frame. But there are a few things that we really appreciate from the previous generations of Toyota trucks. If you wrap around and look here, it was a common thing for the AC drain to drain on top of the frame. Well, not here. It drains away from the frame. So thank you very much for doing that. Same thing, there's another drain on the other side. Another thing, they're covering this now. This is where the cab mount or the body mount is. They're now covering these because these used to be filled up with crud and salt and start corroding. Now it is sealed up. But there is more good news about the frame. Third generation Tacoma had a recall for the frames. We were spraying wax inside of them. Not a great procedure. But look at this one. It already has the wax sprayed inside from the factory. Now, not the whole frame. I think they stop somewhere around here. But this is the vulnerable section. This really protects it from rust on the inside, which is really nice. Then we look at more Toyota stuff. You see these bolts? They look like kind of a bunch of random bolts here that hold nothing. This is actually for your side step, rock crawler, or however you want to call it, the step. They put bolts to not leave the hole open so it would not corrode. This is really nice stuff, and they've been doing this for a long time, and they still do. I am really happy that we're seeing good stuff. I'm not seeing rust stuff. Exhaust is very high quality. Everything I see, this, for lack of a better word, if you put this, put a 5th generation 4Runner, which is as very good built, they're very similar. I like that. This is good news. Look at the back here. Very familiar sight. This, to me, of course not exactly the same, but it looks exactly the same as a 5th generation 4Runner suspension in the back. Very familiar. Different rear end housing, and this does have a locker. Locker is on the inside. I like everything that I see here. Really like everything I see here, because they're keeping things that need to be simple. Now, the one thing that they did change, if you come around here, we do have a parking brake motor on the caliper here. This is your parking brake. And another thing with these trucks, so these are regular shocks on this 1958 model. Optional is AVS. Stands for it does absolutely nothing, just so you know that. I mean, on a truck like this, do you really need adaptive suspension? No, you don't. It's just going to cost you a fortune when it goes out in the future. This is more than sufficient. But something about AVS, the easiest way to know if you have an AVS Land Cruiser or not, get in the car, change the drive mode. If you have 3 drive modes, Eco, Sport, Normal, you don't have AVS. If you have Sport, Sport Plus, 5 drive modes, that has AVS, which is completely useless, just so you know that. Now we go back here. I love that things are open. Like, there is not a lot of real estate. This is something Toyota trucks always do really well. They just leave things wide open. Still use the brake line right on the axle housing. They did switch it to this side. It used to be on this side, which is, I don't see any issue with that. We still have the chain that's going to rattle as you drive in the drive-through or whatnot. Full-size spare tire, folks. I love that, and you will love that too, because so many cars are losing their spare tire, and we are happy with a little donut tire. This thing has a full-size spare tire. This is a brand new model in 24. I like the heading they're going. You're going off-roading with this, you don't want to have a little spare tire that does nothing. The other thing is, this is of course a 6-lug wheel, and it's nuts, not bolts. We're noticing some Toyota and Lexus models are switching to lug bolts, which are horrendous. These are not that. They have 6, they are proper, and I love that. Honestly, folks, I have to say one thing about this truck, looking underneath it, from both a enthusiast, Land Cruiser enthusiast, and a Toyota technician, past and a current owner of a shop that only works on Toyota Lexus, this all looks like good news. I like what they're doing here. I just hope the appearances match the long-term reliability, because this is solid. I like this. Now, one thing about the transfer case, which is kind of a disappointment, I wish they've done it with the Tundra, but they didn't do it with the Tacoma and this. This actuator, if it ever goes out, you have to disassemble the transfer case still. This was kind of a weird design from them. But the 3rd generation Tundra, you can actually remove this without having to disassemble, because they designed it that way. But this one didn't get that. I wish that would change in the future. And last few observations. If we look all the way here, this is kind of new. There is a decent space between the top of the frame and the body. This was not always the case with Toyota trucks. This allows you to really, if you're putting undercoating or something, you can go on top. If you want to clean it, you can really easily access everything. If there are lines here and there's a wire harness here, you can easily access it. This is really cool. Folks, it's all good news here. I really like what I'm seeing here. This looks, especially this, quality of everything. It's a Land Cruiser. It's not just a closed up Tacoma, even though on paper it looks like that, but it doesn't. And lastly, underneath it, I love this small design that makes a huge difference. If you come around and look at this front shock. First, What a beautiful finished shock. Second thing is, do you see where it connects? Right here. Not, it sits in a little thing. I mean, all you gotta do is take this shock, take the top nuts, and this pops out and comes out. It may interfere with the tie rod here, but I feel like you could move it, get it out enough to swing it out, so that makes service very simple. I really like this. And lastly, we have recovery hooks. 2 of them, both sides. That's something that for some reason the 3rd generation Tundra completely thought it didn't need, but this one has them and they're proper. We're happy. Let's look at the outside of the 2024 Toyota Land Cruiser. It is a very Land Cruiser look. It is a lot smaller than the full-size Land Cruiser. After all, this is a 250 series, not a 300 series, so it's a lot smaller. More like the Prado size. That's, I think they should have just called it that. But love these round headlights. Now, this is a 1958 trim. The mid-trim, which is just called Land Cruiser, has different headlights, and then the launch edition is basically a fully loaded Land Cruiser trim with these headlights. I don't know why these are not optional across, but they're not. Now, there is a lot going on in the front that you may have not noted or noticed. First, let's talk about the obvious stuff. Toyota is spelled out in the Heritage grille. Really love that. And behind that, this is the radar sensor. You know, these sections are closed off. That's what the radar sensor is. I love that they put it high up, not low. Now this bumper, again, following the Land Cruiser's off-road heritage, this bumper is called multi-divided bumper. So each one of these panels is a separate piece. So when you hit it going off-road, you don't have to replace the entire bumper. You actually replace the individual piece that got damaged. And not only that, these gaps in Toyota standards, especially a Japanese-built Toyota, these are horrible gaps. And that is intentional, because when you hit this, you have room for this panel to move and not damage the one next to it. That was the intent. I think it works because just having these giant gaps gives it kind of a rugged look. I really love how this looks, especially with the round headlights. It just looks the part. And one more thing they did here. Do you see this little protrusion? That is not something that got just thrown in there, because this is actually a design feature, so if you hit something, it doesn't damage the fender immediately. It damages this first, and you have a little bit of a bumper here, because the rest is multi-divided. This is not. This is the fender. So you notice it's fully protected on the edge. That is pretty cool. Now this thing has, for lack of a better word, a giant box shape. This is heavily shared with the new GX550, but this looks the part. This is a Land Cruiser. This is not some luxury, gimmicky car. This is a Land Cruiser. And they finally got it right in the US to a point. It is not some luxury car. This is an off-roader, and that's what it needs to do, and it needs to do that very well. And look at the features of that. You have a very, almost standing up windshield, similar to the GX550. I just hope this does not join the FJ Cruisers club of in between oil changes we replace 2 windshields, because this is a very steep angle. We only have 2 wipers and a very interesting cowl shape. I haven't seen this in a while, that a car that has a cowl exposed. Usually this is tucked in and they're trying to make these disappear. Not here, because you have this giant windshield that is standing up. The mirrors, they look the part here. This looks proper, not like the GX550. That's a luxury car. Having a mirror like this in the GX550 just doesn't fit. This fits. And these are auto-folding mirrors that you can fold manually. That is something, it's a little sting, because normal auto-folding mirrors, if you do this, you broke it, almost. But this is designed to fold. In case you hit a tree, a shrub, it's not gonna break it. It's gonna push it back. These wheels, I love these wheels, not just for the design aspect, but if you look at them, they have a very interesting profile. They don't stick out. Most wheels will stick out to make them look cool. These stick in, so the tire really comes out. This is for off-roading, folks, so you're not gonna hit the wheel very easily. You have a big chunky tire here. It's an 18-inch tire, 70 height, which is what you want. Now, This is the 1958 model. This is a base model, basically. All this is black. And I usually really dislike when these are just black, not even painted. But in this, I feel like it's a base model. It's a no gimmicks model. You got it all black. Scratch it up with trees and branches, and we're not worried about it. Then we move around the side here. This does have a smart key, only in the fronts though, not the rears, which makes sense. This is the base model. I am divided about this. I don't know if I like that. I wish this would have been just straight back, would have gave you more visibility. I assume they did this for safety purposes to reinforce the body more, but if this was straight, goes back up, I think it would have looked better. It would have just gave it a very unique look. This does have a roof rack over here. It's a very rugged looking roof rack and actually functional, and that is pretty cool. Now as we wrap around the back, folks, this is basically a GX550. It's a little shorter than the GX550 by a few inches, but not by a lot, and I think the body has to do with it. Do you remember when we did the GX550 review, we said, I really dislike this panel. It just looks off. That was a luxury car. It's a lot more expensive than this, but this looks the part. I feel like they started with this and they kind of tacked on the GX550 to it. This rear end looks the part. But did you notice something about this? It nowhere has the Toyota logo. Not anywhere on this car has the Toyota logo. Maybe under the hood a few places, but on the outside, inside, no Toyota logo. Toyota is written out. Even inside, we'll see when we get to the inside. Toyota written out. Land Cruiser, very subtle. Nothing over the top. And if I was an owner of this car, this would be the first thing that gets removed. This looks completely off. First, the Land Cruiser part, the most important part, is blacked out, and this is chrome, looks completely off. I wish this was not even there. I mean, I love how they put iForce Max, and this is in case you're not familiar with what this logo is, this is their Beyond Zero initiative. I'm not going to get into that. They're really proud of it. This is the only powertrain available in this car. Do we need to spell it out? I feel like we don't. Moving on from that though, let's talk about real stuff. First thing is, this opens, which is nice. This is a really nice feature. But what I really dislike is this. The wiper mechanism. So we had this similar wiper mechanism in like previous generations, so you can move it now. And this is the problem. We had it previous in the Highlanders when they had the opening window. So this clips into here and then the motor moves it. But if you open this and do this, then close it, you could crack the glass. So be careful, because this pin will basically get jammed here. Although they did add a safety, but you slam it hard enough, you could break it. I don't like this because eventually this will seize and it will not work. I hope they improve this design, but that was the case in the past with this exact same design. The other elephant in the room is this. So there's a tow hitch there, and just like the GX, just look at this and tell me this is not the biggest afterthought in the planet. It looks horrendous, just horrible. So basically the idea here is you pull this panel, hopefully, which does have two clips at the bottom, which I already removed for this video, and then you have your tow hitch. So what do I do with this now? Just let it dangle and scratch the car and then eventually fall off? Or do I completely remove it and now it feels like somebody hit my car, have clips visible? This is just terrible. But here's their solution to this. Talk about the back door in a second. They give you a second panel. So when you're using your tow hitch, you have to go here, clip this in, and then install this panel. Put two clips at the bottom. Then you have the tow hitch visible. But I still have... This needs more work, Toyota. Seriously. I love that it have a tow hitch built in, although it's part of the frame, which is... wish it was detachable from the frame in case of an accident, but this is not a good idea. It just looks terrible. I feel like this panel, it needs to cover a little bit better, and then you have all... It just doesn't look right. I understand that folks that will tow will care more about the function of the towing, but apparently somebody thought about this and thought this was a horrible idea. That's why we have this second panel that just pops in, and then it's very flimsy and you have to really pull on it and almost bend the whole thing to pull it out. I don't think this is a good idea. That's the one thing I'll say. Moving on from that to the back door, you notice the 1958? No gimmicks. You drive a Land Cruiser, you can open a door. That's the nice thing. Now they do have, in the higher trims, available optional, a dual motor power back door, which has 2 motors, and the motors do have the wires going into the door, which is nice. But I feel like this is the stuff that doesn't break. And if now, because we have a model that does have this, should the power ones break, you could just go buy 2 of these, put them on, now you have a manual door. I like that. Like options. Let's look at the back once we remove the cover and the other cover. This is really a mess. Let's look at the back here. You notice there is a definite hump. This is the part where, I don't know which was designed first, the GX550 or the Land Cruiser, or both at the same time. This is not a great idea. The reason for that is, this is where your hybrid battery is, right underneath this cover, because this is hybrid only. This, you know what this reminds me of? The previous generation Prius Prime. They started with the Prius, 4th generation. They started with the Prius and then they added the Prime, and it looked exactly like this. There was absolutely no storage room and a very high storage. All the storage you have here is this. Could have done this a little better. This is one of the parts that, yeah, this is way too high. And then, the worst part is, there is a part here. The board could break if over 60 kilogram objects are placed on it. So you have 120 pounds to put here, give or take. And what is the first thing that off-roaders will do when they buy a truck like this? They will put massive drawers here. They will put fridges. They will put all kinds of stuff. You can only put 120 pounds? That's, yeah. This part was not thought out very well. Not the end of the world though. But what is the, we don't talk about cup holders here in this channel, because you can see those, I hate those, but we're gonna have to. We have cup holders here. There's no third row in this car, and there's even a USB-C that, okay, maybe that USB-C is for you to charge your stuff here, but I barely reach it. Why can't we just put it here? Now, folding the second row seat is, yeah. So they put these handles, but yeah, I can't even do it. Why can't we put them here? There is, again, a reason for that, and we'll talk about it in a little bit down in the video. Now, once I finally figure out the second row, this folds like this. Good and bad. You can actually do this. You do have a little bit of a protrusion to put stuff, but then you can completely, once I figure it out, okay, now we can do this. Start all over. This does take some space, but also now you have this space. But if this didn't have the hybrid battery where it is, this wouldn't be so high and this would be at the same level. So there is good and bad. There are some compromises, some good stuff. Speaking of the good stuff, let's talk about the most important thing with the hybrid system. If you come around, and we'll show them right here, these are the intakes of the hybrid battery. There's one right here, and there's one same place on the other side. This is where the hybrid battery breathes. This is a filter you gotta service, you gotta maintain, you gotta keep clean, especially if you're gonna go camping with this thing and you're gonna fill it up with stuff. Don't cover that, because that's vital to the life of the battery. You're gonna basically overheat it and we're gonna have issues. There's another one on the other side. I wish they would have thought about this and put the vents in a different spot because of the use of this truck. For camping, for example, you're gonna fill it up with gear, although you can't go over 120 pounds, but I wish that vent would have been somewhere else. That would have been also nice. But what is nice, you have a 2400 watt power outlet. That is really nice to have here. It's a great spot for it. Love it. Then I have one more thing to show you and one more concern. Now, we do have these little lights here, probably not visible on camera. They're very soft lights, but at night, they are really nice to have here. Even though you have a light there, but these just gives you a little bit more light that that one doesn't get. But here's the biggest concern I have with this. Who's gonna use this? What is the purpose of this truck? Off-roading, camping, all kinds of activity. At least that's what they're advertising it to be. Here's the biggest problem I have. What is the number one thing that folks will put in the back here? Let me see. A tent, some gear, a fridge, a cooler that is full of water. And what do coolers love to do? Leak. If you put anything with water here, your dog, that's another one. The hybrid battery is right here. And you're not actually supposed to directly spill water over the hybrid battery. I just have an issue with the placement of the hybrid battery, and I will voice concern over this for you, the owners, if you end up buying one of these. Be careful with this. You actually do not want a large amount of water just dumping on top of the hybrid battery. Even though it is protected, yes. But be aware of this. Just heads up. Well, let's talk about the interior of the 2024 Toyota Land Cruiser, specifically this 1958 edition, which sounds very fancy, but it's actually the base model. And base model it is, because do you really need very fancy leather seats and all the electronics that move them and the power seats and all that? You actually don't in an off-road rig. And that's exactly what you get here. Fabric seats with manual controls. It cannot be more basic than that. And this entire interior is a true breath of fresh air for a base model. I mean, I feel like they started with this and they built the upper trims from here, because this has everything you need in an off-road focused truck. Nothing more, nothing less. There's no gimmicks here, which I love. Let's start looking at some of the stuff and you'll see what I mean. First, of course, the cloth seats that are manual. Love them. They're very comfortable seats, very easy to clean this fabric, and that's all you need. And then the gleaming absence of a sunroof. We don't need a hole in the roof. Thank you very much. If you need one, you can option it out in the upper trims. And the other thing is mechanical shifter. And usually, when you get the lower trim, you get none of the things that this car was made to do, except here. You have center locking diff, rear locking diff, crawl control, hill descent, and all of those are here. That's all you need for off-roading. The only thing that is missing is the front sway bar disconnect, which really, unless you're going like excessive off-roading, if you would, you don't really need that either. This is a very capable truck. But let's go beyond that. Everything here is button. There is nothing in the screen other than the radio functions. Some customizations of the features, but that's about it. And this radio feels like a complete aftermarket radio. It's there, just to play your music and whatnot. It does absolutely nothing for the driving, and that's what I love. Look at your HVAC controls. They're all physical. There is no gimmicks. Takes you no more than 2 seconds to operate them, and we're done. Same thing with all your off-road controls. They're all buttons. No screen, no nothing. Yes, some of your crawl control and hill descent and whatnot, you do need to use the screen in the gauge, which is a tiny little screen with two little temperature gauge and fuel gauge on the side that are not part of the screen. I love that. There's no gimmicks. Even I wish the screen was not here and you'd have two big gauges and a little screen in the middle. That would have been even better, but I can live with that. This is not some giant screen that takes everything away. It's just a small, simple screen. That's all you need here. And that's what I love about this interior. I mean, initially when you look at it, it's like, oh my God, this is so basic. But then you start driving, it's like, I love this. This is just, it has everything I need, nothing more, nothing less. Starting with the important stuff. Right in front of the passenger says Land Cruiser stamped on the dash, because that's the very important part. And then on the steering wheel, doesn't show the Toyota logo. It says Toyota written out in heritage lettering. I love this. This is a really nice touch. The steering wheel. This car is not shy on tech. It has Safety Sense 3.0, which is very sophisticated, but it has a very good way of hiding it. This is a bespoke steering wheel for this car. The buttons and the orientation of things. I love it. It's so basic. It takes you no more than 2 seconds to get used to how everything works. No heads-up display, no gimmicks, no I need the heads-up display to operate. No, just basic. And I love that about it. And you immediately appreciate it. When you get off some of the newer cars with all their gimmicks and the giant screen all the way across, it really gets tiring. Here, you can shut off this radio, dim the screen, you can still operate your car. You don't need those. Now, with that, this is the base model. The upper trims, if you want some of the technology, and that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. Some folks will want it, but if you don't want it, you can get one that has everything you need without the gimmicks. The screen. This is an 8-inch screen. It is Toyota's 21 calendar year operating system. Works pretty good. Glitchy at times, but it's a leap for Toyota for technology. They're usually not good with this stuff. You can option this out in the second trim to a 12.3-inch screen, which is larger, but does exactly the same thing as this one does, so heads up on that. Now, the seats. You can get power seats in the upper trim. You will have the soft text material, so it's like kind of leather, but not really. They are power seats, but then you can option that out to a premium package that gets you leather seats, or you can get the launch edition with leather seats. If you ask me, this right here is perfect, because usually manual seats are not comfortable, but these are super comfortable, and that is really nice. Now, even though this is the base model, you expect it to have no creature comforts at all. You still have steering heater, still have heated seats, and they are physical button right here, super simple to operate. You clearly see a lot of blank switches here for options that you don't have, but they're not over the top. There's only 2 here, one here for the cooled seats, and then one here for the front sway bar disconnect. That's about it. Center console, it's a big center console, which is what you need. I love the retro HVAC vent on the sides, and it just gives it a kind of a unique character. Visibility is really good. In the side and rear visibility, it could be better because of that hump in the body. It could be better if that was flat, but it's not bad for a truck like this, and I really like it. Huge mirrors, very comfortable interior, very smooth driving, and that is the cool thing. Now, the engine being a 4-cylinder, if you really push it, you'll hear it buzz, but on normal driving, you're not going to feel it underpowered, even though it's a big truck. You're not going to feel it underpowered. It's very smooth with a hybrid system. Things are smooth. The only concern I have is occasionally at low speeds, you're coming to a stop or you're kind of taking off slowly. It kind of bucks and takes a minute to decide. I hope they resolve that, because otherwise this hybrid system is pretty smooth. And then there is one thing that is pretty interesting, just a small observation. The center console lid, it's actually not fabric. It feels like maybe the Softex or leather. I feel like they decided to put the same center console in all the trims and just call it a day, not make one for the 1958, because it was not worth it. So this is the only leather you get in the car, because the door panels are all plastic, not cheapo plastic. It actually feels like solid plastic, but there's absolutely no amenities in the material and wowing department. That's the whole point of this, and I love them for doing that, because this is a breath of fresh air with how non-gimmicky it is. And I love the 1958 edition. I just wish it had the disconnecting front sway bar as an option. And there's one last thing I want to talk to you about, not really with the interior itself, but with the technology behind the scenes. So Toyota is starting, finally joining the 21st century with their electronics. So you are used to, when you have a smart key with a button, you press it in the first position is accessory. You press it in the second position, the ignition is on. This does not have an accessory position. And this is something they're starting to do finally. A lot of manufacturers actually have done this long time ago. So when you shut off the car, you are in parking mode. You're stopped, car's off, radio remains on until you open the door, then it shuts off. But did you know that when the car is off, if you press the power button when you just shut off the car, even if you open the door, within 20 minutes, you can actually turn on the radio, and that is accessory mode for 20 minutes. That was pretty cool. They're finally changing their electronics to kind of a modern electronic, because accessory mode doesn't absolutely make sense with a push button start, because that mimics the key part. And that's what Toyota's been doing for a long time. They're finally moving away from that. And lastly, on the front here, everywhere around this car, you will not see the Toyota badge at all. You will see Toyota written out, which is super cool, except one place. When you turn on the infotainment system, you will see the Toyota logo. I wish they would have changed that. That would have been really cool. Let's talk about the back seat of the Land Cruiser. I'm 5'7", this is my driving position. I have decent knee room, really good headroom because this doesn't have a sunroof in the 1958 edition. Very comfortable back seat with a couple observations here. So in the middle, they have this, the panel kind of extends the center console and it covers half the foot area here. It's kind of a strange thing. I wish that was not there because it kind of protrudes, and if you have a passenger in the middle, it's going to interfere with their leg space. The other thing is, this has roof vents even in where the non-existing third row seat is. This is the GX effect, I suppose, and you do have a separate climate zone for the back. That is actually pretty cool on a base model. That's why I said they were able to hide the nice options here, and when you buy the base model, you're not buying a model that will make you envious of everybody else that got the nice features and you got nothing. This does have really nice features for what it is, but they are very subtly hidden there, and that is pretty cool. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the 24 Toyota Land Cruiser, starting with, where is my exclusivity of the Land Cruiser, Toyota? This shares a lot with the Tacoma now. It used to share stuff with the Sequoia a little bit, Tundra a little bit, but now it shares stuff with the Tacoma. Now the question is, did the Land Cruiser lower its status to join the rest, or does the rest raise their standard to meet the Land Cruiser? I hope it's the latter, but time will tell, I suppose. And the second thing is, you know, there's been a cry out for a long time from Land Cruiser enthusiasts and owners, and hopefully future owners, that the Land Cruiser was way too expensive. The 200 series was a status symbol. It became unreachable for most. So they responded, they come up with this. No gimmicks, focused, laser focused. It is smaller, yes. It's not the big full-size Land Cruiser, that's fine. But $56,000 for a base model with cloth seats and manual seats, it's still pretty expensive. And then it only goes up from there as you increase options and whatnot. But then there's a bigger issue. This is a Land Cruiser, and it costs what it costs, and I love it for it. I love this thing. I love how focused it is. But what is that going to make of the upcoming 25 4Runner, which is going to be the same powertrain, roughly the same size, built on the same platform, and shares basically the same image as an off-roader. So unless the 4Runner is going to be cheaper, I see these two are going to conflict, because only the purist will want a Land Cruiser. They will want their car to say those two words, so they will pay up for it. But everybody else will just take one good look at this and be like, why am I paying a premium for two words when I can buy the exact same car, the exact same capabilities, with the exact same reliability, what have you, for less? I see that as an upcoming problem in the future, because the 4Runner is going to have the same powertrain, and it's roughly going to be the same size, and it's also going to be capable off-road, if not share everything with this. So what's going on here? Are we going to run this for a few years and cancel it again? I hope not, because I really like this thing, but that's definitely going to be an issue. And lastly, one more thing I really dislike about this car. Premium fuel, Toyota? I thought that was a GX thing. Tacoma doesn't take you premium fuel. Why does this one take premium fuel? They have the same powertrain. I wish that was not the case. And finally, we have the Land Cruiser back. And in this form, initially, when it first came out, when they first announced it, they were talking about it, and the whole press releases and everything, I had my concerns. But now that I've spent a week with this one, I'm actually glad they did this, and they did this well, with some concerns, which we'll briefly talk about here. The first thing is, this is heavily shared the GX 550, which I thought kind of lost the typical GX magic. But this is proper. A Land Cruiser needs to be good at one thing: cruising the land. As the name suggests, it needs to be properly capable off-road. And this is every bit as much as that. It needs to be rugged and well-made and long-lasting. This has everything going for it to do that. First, the looks. I mean, this is a proper off-road look. It's just a giant box. Doesn't even have Toyota logos all over it. It just says Toyota written out, like the old school times. You look at the inside, in this particular 1958 trim, there's no gimmicks, there's no nonsense. There's just a focused interior on off-roading. You even have cloth seats, manual seats. You have every bit of kit for the off-roading part, except, which I wish it was available as an option for the 1958 trim, the front disconnecting sway bars. But still, as it sits, this is a very capable off-roader. Doesn't have any gimmicks, no sunroof, no giant screen, no everything is in the screen and all that. No, this is back to form. I love that part about it. This, when we first came here, we saw it like cloth seats. That's okay, but as you drive it, you get it. I get it why this doesn't have power seats, because that's what people wanted. The 300 series is way too expensive. They bring it here. The 200 series was way too expensive for most folks to be able to reach it. This is focused, and I love that about it. Now, the powertrain choice is interesting here. See, there's been a lot of folks that are concerned about turbo engines and the whole thing, and the Tundra is not helping, and the V35 is not helping at all. But this particular engine has been out since 2023 in a very mainstream car, which is the Highlander. This is a version of that. Yes, it is modified for this, but so far so good. We are hoping that the turbo engines will hold and we won't have severe issues. Eventually, you will have issues, especially with bad maintenance, but we're hoping they will hold, and this once more proves to be a Land Cruiser proper. Underneath it though, it is every bit as much of a Land Cruiser. I mean, the build quality here is very good. You know, we looked at the Tundra, we looked at the Sequoia, there was a lot of stuff that were not built well. Not here. This is very well put together, and I love the trim and kind of the optioning. If you want a proper Land Cruiser, just buy the 1958. Don't look any further. It has everything you need and more for the purpose of buying a Land Cruiser. If you want more option, there's one more trim up, and if you're one of the early adopters, you kind of get a special version, the launch edition. But really, all the launch edition is, it's a 1958 with all the options of the Land Cruiser trim. Basically, that's what it is, without the square headlights. Now, nothing is perfect in life. The problem with this is it does share too much with the GX 550. Nothing wrong with that, but for example, the cup holder is in the back, and the USB-C connectors, and the useless handle on the back seat. That's because they designed this initially with a third row seat, but for this, doesn't get it because it's not a GX 550. And then the hybrid battery location is terrible. It's not a great idea. This kind of goes against the point of this car. And then the powertrain as a whole. Even though this is the first year, and I hope this is something they can fix with the software update, does have moments of clunkiness. It was kind of a surprise because the Tundra hybrid, with all its issues, we're not going to get into that, that is a smoother system than this one. Maybe because it's a 4-cylinder, but it's a very capable 4-cylinder. It does have decent power for what the intended use, but still, a little bit of clunkiness could be addressed and life would be a lot better. But the biggest thing remains, what exactly is this going to do to the 4Runner? And at this price, it's a pretty high price for a base model. But at least you're buying a Land Cruiser. People want the name. That's why when we had the 200 series, the Land Cruiser and the LX, the Land Cruiser was always more expensive in the used market, and they retained their value better just because of the name. People want the name. So I'm assuming this people will tend to want to pay more for because it is a Land Cruiser, not a 4Runner. But logically, I don't know how this is going to be placed alongside the 4Runner, because the 4Runner will have the same powertrain, It'll be roughly the same size. It'll also be built for off-road, and we are hoping that it is cheaper. But if it comes out to be the same prices, what's going on here? Do we have two of this exact same car, just with a different body? That's the other concern. But folks, we complained, and Toyota listened. We complained that the Land Cruiser was way too expensive, that nobody can reach it. People who bought it, they bought it as a mall cruiser, and that's not what it is. So they made a more basic version. And this 1958 trim, I think is the best one. You got no nonsense inside. You got cloth seats, manual seats, no gimmicks. Everything is touch button. You got a little screen that plays music, and that's about it. That's the whole point of a Land Cruiser. That's what made the Land Cruiser one day, and here we are again. I love this thing, and this thing definitely has a huge character, and I will take this any day over the GX550, even though they're basically the same car, because the GX550 needs to be a luxury car, and in that department, doesn't do it very well. This needs to be a Land Cruiser, and it does that so well. The minute you get into behind the steering wheel and start driving it, you get it. This is a Land Cruiser. It just feels like a Land Cruiser on every level. It's not perfect, but you know what? Nobody is perfect. But this is as close as we're going to get to a Land Cruiser in the US in 24, and I'm really happy with it. Folks, I hope this video is helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.